scent of aged scotch and expensive cigar smoke usually signified triumph for the five friends gathered in the opulent penthouse. Tonight, however, a new aroma permeated the air, a faint, metallic tang like old pennies and dried blood, subtle but insistent, clinging to the velvet curtains and the polished mahogany of the poker table. Richard, the host, a man whose wealth was only surpassed by his arrogance, had arranged for a new dealer this year, a last-minute replacement after their usual man called in sick. Her name was Lena. She was introduced simply, without fanfare, her presence a quiet ripple in the boisterous room. Lena moved with an unsettling grace, her hands pale and slender, shuffling the deck with a precision that bordered on surgical. Her eyes, a startling shade of ice blue, never met theirs directly, instead sweeping across their faces with a detached, almost scientific interest. Elias, the nervous one, felt the first prickle of unease. It wasn't just her reserved demeanor. It was the way she seemed to absorb the light, drawing the shadows around her like a living cloak. The grand penthouse, with its panoramic city views, suddenly felt like a stage, and they were the unwilling actors as the first hand was dealt. A cold, visceral sensation began to spread through the room. Cards felt heavier, colder, almost damp against their fingertips. Mark, always the showman, chuckled nervously as he picked up his hand, but his usual boisterous energy was muted. Lena's gaze, when it finally settled on him, was brief but chilling, like a razor blade sliding beneath the skin. It was then that the first metamorphosis of the evening began, not in their bodies, but in the atmosphere itself. The laughter died, the easy camaraderie evaporated. The air grew thick, textured as if filled with unseen dust. The true trauma began when Lena spoke, her voice a low, melodic hum that somehow cut through the hum of the city outside. She didn't announce beds or blinds. She announced rules. The heavy oak door to the penthouse, which Richard always left ajar for their smoking breaks, slammed shut with a reverberating thud. A distinct, metallic click echoed through the room. Richard, startled, tried the handle. It was locked, bolted from the outside by a mechanism he didn't recognize. Panic, cold and sharp, began to bloom in the pit of his stomach. Lena's blue eyes finally lifted, meeting each of theirs in turn. A subtle smile, thin and chilling, touched her lips. She wasn't just the dealer. She was the architect of their confinement. She explained, her voice devoid of emotion, that the stakes for tonight's game were different. The chips on the table were irrelevant. The only way to leave the penthouse, she said, was to gamble with their darkest secrets. Elias felt a sudden, sharp intake of breath, a memory rising from the shadows of his past, a screech of tires, a sickening thud, and the frantic, hushed agreement to drive away. The exposed truth hit Richard like a physical blow. Lena's face, when viewed through the filter of his rising fear, began to shift. The angle of her jaw, the curve of her lips, they were eerily familiar. 10 years ago, a late-night drive, too much champagne, and a collision on a deserted country road. A young girl, a flash of red hair, lying motionless in the headlights. The image, suppressed for a decade, now flared with a viral horror clarity. Lena was the sister. Revenge was palpable, hanging in the air like the smoke from a dying fire. Lena dealt the next hand, her movements slow, deliberate, each card laid down like a gravestone. On the back of each card, instead of the usual pattern, was a single, stark image, a faded photograph of a smiling girl with vibrant red hair. Girl they had left for dead on the asphalt. Richard felt the shadow self of his past choices rise to choke him. The analog horror was the reality itself. The game was rigged, the dealer was vengeance, and they were the unwitting players in their own confession. The penthouse, a monument to their untouchable wealth, became a claustrophobic cage. The glass walls that once offered stunning views of the city now reflected only their own distorted faces, eyes wide with dawning terror. Lena wasn't asking for money. She was asking for their souls. Elias, sweating profusely, looked at his hand. 3 aces, a winning hand in any other game. But on the back of the aces, the girl's face was smiling, her eyes fixed on him, pulling him into the shadows of his guilt. Lena's voice, a soft, hypnotic drone, explained the betting rounds. Each round they would confess a secret, a smaller secret to stay in the hand, a bigger one to raise. Pot would be the cumulative weight of their hidden truths. The loser would be exposed completely. The winner, if there could even be one, would simply be allowed to leave. But the way she said leave made it sound less like freedom and more like a final. permanent expulsion from the world of the living dot as the first round of betting began. The lights in the penthouse flickered, then dimmed, casting long, dancing shadows across the faces of the terrified men. The city outside, once a vibrant tapestry of light, seemed to fade, replaced by an inky blackness that pressed against the windows. Lena's blue eyes glowed faintly in the gloom, reflecting the images of the red-haired girl from the cards. Elias felt a cold hand brush against his ankle under the table. He looked down. Nothing was there, but the sensation lingered, a spectral touch that promised retribution. Richard, desperate to regain control, slammed his hand on the table. "This is insane," he bellowed, his voice cracking. "We're not playing this game." Lena's smile widened, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift of her waxy features. She pointed a slender finger at the door. "Oh, but you already are," she whispered. "The game started 10 years ago, and the first bet was placed when you drove away. Then," the red-haired girl's face on the back of Elias's cards began to weep. The ink ran, staining the cards a chilling, wet crimson. The crimson stain on the cards didn't just sit on the surface. It began to seep into the mahogany, spreading like a blooming bruise across the table. The sensation was no longer just psychological. The room's temperature plummeted and the air took on a thick, viscous quality, making every breath feel like inhaling wet wool. Lena sat perfectly still, her hands folded over the deck, her silhouette sharpening against the dimming light until she looked less like a woman and more like a hole cut out of reality. The metamorphosis of the penthouse was accelerating. The gold leaf molding on the ceiling began to peel and curl, revealing a dark, pulsing organic matter beneath that thrummed with a rhythmic, low-frequency vibration. Richard's bravado had curdled into a frantic, sweating desperation. He looked at his four friends, men he had built empires with, and saw only shadows of their former selves. Their expensive suits seemed to hang off their frames as if their very muscles were being digested by their rising trauma. Mark, the most athletic of the group, was staring at his own hands. The skin was turning a translucent, waxy gray, the same texture as the staff in a nightmare. The exposed nature of the game was stripping them of their social armor, leaving nothing but the raw, quivering nerves of their guilt. Lena signaled for the first bet. She didn't use words. She simply tapped a card that bore the image of a shattered headlight. Elias, whose resolve was the first to snap, leaned forward. His voice was a raspy wheeze, a sensation of sand in his throat. He confessed to a minor embezzlement from 5 years ago, a drop in the bucket, compared to their collective net worth. As the secret left his lips, a physical weight seemed to lift from his chest, but it was replaced by a claustrophobic dread. A single chip, carved from what looked like yellowed bone, slid across the table toward the center. The shadows in the corner of the room crept closer, sensing the feeding had begun. The game was a shadow loom, weaving their individual sins into a collective shroud. As each man placed to bet confessions of infidelity, insider trading, and hidden cruelties, the penthouse began to expose its own inner workings. Panoramic windows, which should have shown the shimmering skyline of the city, now displayed a loop of analog horror footage. The empty, moonlit road from 10 years ago, filmed from the perspective of the car's bumper. The footage was grainy, flickering with the rhythmic thump-thump of the tires over gravel. Every time a secret was told, the footage moved closer to the moment of impact. The metamorphosis became physical for Mark, as he confessed to a betrayal of his own brother. His fingernails began to turn that same bruised, necrotic purple that Elias had seen in his own nightmare. The sensation was one of a slow, cold unskinning. He wasn't just losing a game. He was losing his realistic humanity. He reached for his glass of scotch, but the liquid had turned into a thick, black ichor that smelled of stagnant pond water and copper. Lena watched him with an unblinking, vengeance-filled gaze, her blue eyes reflecting the flickering shadows of the red-haired girl, who was now appearing in the peripheral vision of everyone at the table. The trauma of the hit and run was no longer a memory. It was the dealer. Lena explained that the pot was reaching its capacity. The secrets were getting darker, the air heavier. She dealt a new round, but this time the cards were blank on the front. They were mirrors. When Richard looked into his card, he didn't see his face. He saw the face of the girl as she hit the windshield, the sensation of the glass shattering, the sensation of the impact, the sensation of her last wet breath. The card was a direct feed into the moment they had all tried to erase. revenge was being served in slices of sensation. Lena's voice, now echoing with the layered pitches of a dozen different ghosts, told them that the final round was approaching. To stay in, they would have to bet the core of their identity. They would have to admit not just that they did it, but that they liked the feeling of getting away with it. The viral horror of their own narcissism was being turned against them. The room began to shrink, the walls moving inward by inches with every heartbeat. The claustrophobia becoming a physical crushing of their ribs. Elias, unable to bear the shadows any longer, tried to stand up, but his chair had fused with his body. The velvet upholstery was now a part of his skin, a metamorphosis that anchored him to the table. He was becoming a fixture of the game, permanent manifestation of the penthouse's trauma. He looked at Lena, his eyes pleading, but she only adjusted the deck with a surgical precision that suggested she was just getting started. "The blinds are up," Lena whispered, and the sound was like dry leaves skittering over a grave. "The next bed requires the name of the one who was driving, not the collective we, the I." A sudden, violent seismic shudder rocked the penthouse. The analog footage on the windows froze on the girl's face, her eyes wide and fixed directly on Richard. The shadows in the room detached from the walls and began to pace behind the men, their long, multi-jointed fingers brushing against the napes of their necks. Richard looked at his mirror card. The reflection was no longer a memory. The girl in the card reached out a pale, wet hand, her fingers pressing against the surface from the inside, leaving a smudge of ancient dust on the glass. The seismic shudder didn't stop. It settled into a permanent, bone-deep vibration that turned the penthouse into a tuning fork for their terror. The metamorphosis had moved past the decor and into their very anatomy. Richard felt his teeth loosening in his gums, a sensation of shifting calcification as if his body were preparing to shed its realistic form. Beside him, Elias was no longer just fused to the chair. He was being absorbed by it. The velvet had become a network of capillaries drinking the sweat from his pores, turning the upholstery a deep, pulsing plum color. They were no longer guests. They were the nutrient hosts for Lena's ritual. The exposed truth of the driver's identity hung in the air, a shadow more substantial than the men themselves. Lena's blue eyes were now twin voids, sucking the light out of the room until the only illumination came from the flickering analog footage on the windows. The loop had changed. It was no longer the road. It was a macro shot of a human eye, Richard's eye widening in the rearview mirror as they sped away. The trauma was being broadcast in high definition, the sensation of the accelerator beneath his foot resonating through the floorboards. Lena dealt the turn card. It landed with a wet thud. It wasn't cardstock anymore. It was a square of living tissue, a patch of skin that still bore the faint, white scar of a road rash burn. The revenge was becoming tactile. He reached out to touch it, his own fingers now multi-jointed and pale, his metamorphosis into a shadow self nearly complete. As his skin met the card, a sensation of cold asphalt rushed through his nerves. He didn't just remember the night. He felt the stagnant air of the ditch where they had tossed the girl's red scarf. The claustrophobia reached a breaking point. The walls were now so close that the men's elbows were pinned against their sides. The opulent penthouse had shrunk into the dimensions of a casket, a 10 by 10 space of trauma where every secret was a physical weight. Lena's voice, now a chorus of shadows, demanded the bet. Richard looked at the bone chips. They weren't chips anymore. They were teeth, the girl's milk teeth, lost years before the accident, reclaimed from the maternal source of her family's grief to be used as currency. In this viral horror gamble, I wasn't the only one, Richard gasped, his voice a shadow of its former authority. He tried to point at Mark, but his arm was a heavy, useless limb of waxy meat. The revenge of the group was the collapse of their shared history. To save himself, Richard began to expose the others. He spoke of how Mark had suggested the shortcut, how Elias had seen her hand move and said it was just a reflex, how they had all laughed nervously as they washed the copper blood from the fender. With every word, the metamorphosis of his friends accelerated. They were becoming biological archives of the crime, their skin turning into the vellum of the blueprints for their own destruction. The sensation of being watched had reached a fever pitch. The red-haired girl was no longer a reflection or a shadow in the corner. She was under the table. They could feel the rhythmic thumping of her head against the mahogany thump-thump, Thump-Thump, the sound of a heart that refused to stop beating even after the spoiling of her body. The trauma was a living thing now, a metamorphosis of grief into a predatory manifestation. Lena leaned forward, her shadow self expanding until it covered the entire table. She wasn't just the sister. She was the architect of the unscanning. She revealed the river card, the final card of the game. It was a mirror, but instead of showing their faces, it showed the void inside them. Richard looked in and saw the 10 by 10 room in his own soul empty, windowless space where he had kept his guilt for a decade. The room was no longer empty. It was filled with the ancient dust of the girl's remains, and the metamorphosis was turning his own ribs into the bars of a cage. The pot is right, Lena whispered, her voice a surgical incision in the silence. But the winner doesn't get the teeth. The winner gets to become the new driver. She slid a heavy brass key across the table. It was the key to the car from 10 years ago, a vehicle that should have been crushed in a scrapyard long ago. The analog footage on the window suddenly shifted to a live feed of the penthouse's own parking garage. There sat the black sedan, its engine idling, its headlights cutting through the shadows like two milky eyes. Richard felt a sudden, violent pull from the floor. The metamorphosis was taking its final form. He wasn't being released. He was being recalibrated. He was being drafted into the eternal loop of the accident. The trauma was the engine, and he was the piston as he reached for the key. The shadows of his friends began to liquefy, their forms melting into the mahogany table, becoming a skin carpet for Lena to walk upon. The revenge was absolute. They weren't just dying. They were being integrated into the house of her grief. Richard's hand closed round the key. It was freezing. A sensation of absolute zero that traveled up his arm and crystallized his heart. He looked at Lena, his face a mask of frantic, sweating concentration. Where do I drive? EWHEZ. Lena pointed toward the window. The glass was no longer there. Only the abyss of the night road. You drive until she wakes up, Lena said. From beneath the table. A small, pale hand reached up and gripped Richard's wrist. The fingers were multi-jointed, covered in a translucent membrane, and the grip was a seismic force that began to pull him through the floorboards. The floor of the penthouse did not shatter. It dissolved into a viscous ebony ink that swallowed Richard's legs to the knees. The metamorphosis was total. His friends Mark, Elias, and the others were no longer men, but structural elements of the room. Their faces were stretched across the leather of the chairs, their eyes becoming the dim, flickering recessed lights in the ceiling. Forced to watch the revenge they had collectively earned, the claustrophobia shifted from the walls into his own chest. His lungs felt like they were being lined with the same waxy plaster of the girl's headstone. Lena stood up, her silhouette expanding until it blotted out the analog footage on the windows. She wasn't just a dealer anymore. She was the great architect of this localized purgatory. She reached out and peeled the skin card from the table, and as she did, Richard felt a corresponding layer of his own identity being flayed away. The exposed reality was that the penthouse was the car, the table was the dashboard, and the trauma of 10 years ago was the only thing keeping the lights on. He was being recalibrated to exist in a state of perpetual, high-velocity impact. The small, pale hand around his wrist tightened, the multi-jointed fingers sinking into his flesh, as if his skin were nothing more than soft membrane. The girl, the manifestation of their hit and slowly climbed out from beneath the table. She didn't have a face, only a void where the features should be. A 10 by 10 square of absolute darkness that mirrored the room in Richard's soul. The sensation of her presence was a crushing seismic weight. She smelled of rain-slicked asphalt and raw meat. She didn't scream. She produced a low, rhythmic hum that rattled the teeth in the pot. The game is over. Lena's voice echoed, layered with the shadows of 1,000 grieving sisters. The winner takes the seat. A sudden, violent pull dragged Richard through the floorboards. He didn't fall into the garage. He fell into the driver's seat of the black sedan, which was now fused into the very center of the penthouse. The steering wheel was made of calcified bone, and the windshield was a living cataract showing the dark, rain-swept road of 2016. He tried to let go of the brass key, but it had melted into his palm, a permanent branding of his role. He was the pilot of a ghost. Beside him, in the passenger seat, the girl sat motionless. Her red hair was wet and matted with ancient dust. The sensation of her breathing was a slow, ragged intake of air passing through her throat clogged with fluid. Inhale, pause, exhale. Every time she breathed, the penthouse groaned, the shadows of his friends on the walls pulsing with a purple light. Richard realized the trauma wasn't a memory he was reliving. It was a fuel he was providing. He was the engine of her afterlife. Drive, the girl whispered. It wasn't a voice. It was a vibration that bypassed his ears and resonated in his marrow. Richard slammed his foot onto the accelerator. Pedal was soft like spongy skin. Car didn't move forward in space, but in time, the penthouse walls began to fold inward, the luxury furniture collapsing into a single point of non-existence. The metamorphosis was pulling the entire world into the 10 by 10 square of the accident. He looked in the rearview mirror and saw Lena standing on the receding skin carpet of the table. Her work finished. She was the only thing in the room that was real. As the car accelerated, the windshield began to expose the moment of the hit and run over and over again. Every time the car struck the shadow of the girl on the road, Richard felt his own bones snap and reset. This was the revenge of the loop. He was the driver, the car, and the victim all at once. The claustrophobia was now a biological archive of pain, a viral horror that would never reach a destination, because the destination was the impact itself. He looked at his hands on the bone wheel. They were translucent, the veins glowing with the house's sickly light. He realized with a jolt of realistic horror that he was becoming the dealer in 10 years. Another group of successful men would take a wrong turn, and he would be the one sitting at the table, shuffling a deck of mirror cards, waiting to expose their secrets. The replacement cycle was perfect. The car plunged into an absolute Cimmerian blackness. The sound of the engine became a chorus of his friends' screams. Fading into the rhythmic thump-thump of the tires, Richard looked to his right. The girl was gone. In her place sat the shadow of himself from 10 years ago. His face twisted into a mask of frantic, sweating concentration, staring at the road ahead. "Don't stop," the shadow Richard whispered. "We can still get away with it." As the car struck the girl for the billionth time, 10 by 10 space inside Richard's ribs finally burst open. Metamorphosis was complete. He wasn't the man in the car anymore. He was the sound of the impact. The penthouse was gone. The friends were gone. There was only the road, the rain, and the eternal echo of a screeching brake that never quite brings the world to a halt.